Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for November 15th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today, we're joined online by Jim Clausing. He's a security and forensics analyst on our team here. And Jim, welcome to the program. And I've got a question for you. Have you been out on the bike lately?
I was out on the bike twice last week. It's a little chilly and damp out there now, but I think I'll be out there later this week. Yeah.
All right, very good. Got to keep up with it. You know, we're not getting any younger, so we have to keep out and
absolutely
pushing those pedals a little bit harder to keep up with things. So glad to hear it. And welcome to the program, Jim. And we have Colin Connor here. Welcome, Colin. And you lead our security incident response team, and you've come from the DirecTV family and are working your way in as a part of the big collective AT&T family. So welcome.
Thank you.
So, and well, it's good to have you here. You're usually out in Colorado.
Correct, yeah.
So you're joining us here in New Jersey.
Yeah, we've not had our first big snow yet. I come this morning and it's raining. We've not had rain in a week, so hopefully I can bring some of that cold and wet weather back to Colorado, and we can get to skiing, snowboarding soon.
From what I had seen, actually, the cold is up in the Midwest, northern Midwest, and kind of working its way this direction. So I'm not real optimistic you're going to be dragging some of that wet home, but hopefully we'll get some good skiing weather out in Colorado a little later in the season.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I'm Brian Rexroad, and well, let's go to the first story here. And first one, actually, this is one that I think a lot of folks that are working in the virtual machine space are going to be paying attention to here, Jim. So tell us what you found.
This one has been reported the last couple of days. Last week there was a security conference in South Korea called the Power of Community, and as part of that they had their 2016 Pwn Fest. And as part of this Pwn Fest, various security researchers tried to attack various products and could win money if they were able to break into certain products. This one particular group earned almost $300,000. They earned $140,000 for hacking into Windows Edge browser, which is the new browser in Windows 10, and they earned $150,000 for managing a virtual machine escape in VMware Workstation and Fusion.
Wow. For
those of us who use Workstation and Fusion a lot, like me and most other security researchers, we like to keep virtual machines around to do some of our malware analysis. This is kind of a worrisome deal. Mm-hmm. VMware actually put out 2 updates to both Workstation and Fusion within the space of 4 or 5 days in the last week and a half. So they have actually fixed the vulnerability that was exploited here. Which is a good thing. I'm not aware that the exploit or chain of exploits was ever seen in the wild, but this is a big deal. If you run Workstation or Fusion, make sure that you're up to Workstation 12.5.2 or Fusion, I believe it's 8.5.2. Mm-hmm. There is also some mitigation if you can't, for some reason, update to it. If you turn off drag and drop, which allows you to drag a file from your desktop onto the virtual machine or vice versa, and the copy and paste that allows you to share clipboard stuff between your host and the guest, then these vulnerabilities don't work. It does not affect ESX, so it doesn't affect things like HVDs, hosted virtual desktops, which we're seeing a lot more of in enterprises these days. ESX was not in any way affected, but Workstation and Fusion, so Workstation on Windows or Mac, both were affected, both were updated in the last week and a half.
Okay. So I'm fascinated actually by these prizes because they are pretty sizable prizes for this type of activity. But I have to think that if cyber attacks were a spectator sport, these would be in the tens of millions.
Yeah. And these were sizable prizes because, the ability to break out of a virtual machine is, the holy grail for, attacking virtualization infrastructure. To be able to break out of the virtual machine and attack the host or the hypervisor, that's what the attackers are looking for, the ability to spread, move beyond and spread. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
These are a big deal, and that was a decent sized prize.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind having that kind of money.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be interesting to. And do you have any perspective on how much effort, how much time they had to put into being able to do that? I'm expecting that there would have been some preparation or homework they had to do prior.
Yes, actually, the guys who did the VMware break-in. In one of the stories, I saw that they had been working on it for about 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so put into perspective, and it's multiple people, splitting across them. I mean, it's not chump change. It's certainly a sizable prize, and I'm glad they're rewarded for their effort because if they hadn't been, then it all goes to the bad guys. All right, very good, Jim. Thanks for bringing that to us. Colin, we'll go to you here, and new DDoS attack vector has been basically discovered and published. I guess we're not really sure to what extent this is being used in the wild. We haven't really seen anything that's been, I would describe as notable at this point, but certainly one to be paying attention to. So tell us.
Correct. So just to be clear, this is a denial of service attack. Not a distributed, a single laptop
good point.
could actually initiate this. Some mobile testing, the mobile devices weren't quite able to produce enough traffic to be effective, but a single laptop is definitely where the report
Probably not my laptop.
It may be. It may be. So anyways, details of the attack. This is discovered by the SOC, Danish telecom operator TDC. It uses ICMP, destination unreachable messages, so specifically ICMP type 3, code 3 for those network gurus out there. ICM type 3 is also used for path MTU discovery. So it's opened in firewalls, and that's kind of where the dilemma comes, is that there's specific rules that allow things in there, and path MTU becomes very useful for efficiency, effective communication for IPsec, PPTP, and other VPN type technologies to try to figure out how much bandwidth, how many packets, how much data they can shove in a single packet. That surprisingly, that this attack, like I said, from a single laptop, single system, 20 megabits per second is fairly effective to be taking down some of the major vendors, the Cisco's, SonicWalls, Palo Altos. So it's quite surprising that you could have gigabit, 10 gigabit interfaces, but even 20 megabit of this traffic sustained can cause what really happens is the CPU begins to spike, and then it just can't keep up with the traffic. And there's evidence as well that logging has some additional effects on the CPU. Of course, you have to do more. That you have to. You can't process as much traffic. It's quite surprising that there's multiple vendors involved here. It's not clear if it's common coding or if it's a common library or what may span multiple vendors. A lot of times we see vulnerabilities just by a single vendor. As you mentioned, Brian, we've not seen this behavior in overall AT&T backbone. Definitely some backscatter from some DDoS attacks and some ICMP traffic, but nothing that's clearly attacks from our data. The TDC, saw the spike in traffic, the Danish telecom, and investigated further, with packet captures, and were able to reproduce the behavior, not with the standard ping that we have, but a very similar tool that can generate these ICMP type 3 messages. And so they have a detailed report on the web that you can look, and they show different, like I said, even a mobile device they tested to see how it can be effective or not in this attack. Mitigation, to some extent, is fairly simple. Block the specific ICMP if you can. The major vendors, of course, have patches out. And as always, your anti-DDoS service is going to be able to help rate limit or otherwise control these kind of situations.
Right. Well, even beyond a DDoS service, I mean, typically you're going to need a DDoS service because, as you pointed out, this might be possible with a single IP address, but generally speaking, if you see this in the wild, it's most likely going to be a number of source addresses that are showing, and they might be even spoofing the address, so you might not know exactly where it's coming from.
Right.
So the mitigation service is going to be pretty important to be able to get that under control, filter out the bad stuff. I think, Jim, as you'd suggested earlier, perhaps rate limiting is a good approach, because in some cases you actually do want these messages to go through, but you certainly don't need, tens of thousands of packets per second going through. You really only need one for the system to basically be able to calibrate.
Right. For that, if you can rate limit the type 3, code 3 in front of the firewall device, because, as you said, those aren't packets that you're going to see, that you would expect to see tens of megabits per second. You'd expect to see a handful.
Right.
So, rate limit those, but you don't want to just block all the ICMP type 3s, because, as Colin said, the type 3 code 4, the fragmentation needed but dump fragment bit was set, is what we use for path MTU discovery, for figuring out, as you said, the largest amount of data you can shove in a single packet without causing it to fragment. So, and then the other thing to note is there are, while this did affect some of the Cisco ASAs, the bigger ones were less affected. Those that have multiple cores were less affected. Obviously, they got more computing power, so to affect them would have required, another
laptop,
additional factor of traffic. But the report on there shows the hping command, which is a tool I've used for 10 years for packet crafting in pen tests and so forth. It's very simple to create it, the amount of traffic that would be needed. So.
Right.
Yeah, generating this traffic is not going to be a big challenge for an attacker. So that's obviously something to be taken into account. So the mitigation platform, I think, as you suggested, Jim, perhaps the router upstream would be a good place to put some rate limiting in place, and perhaps have that ahead of time, and then maybe alert on any indications of of the rate limit being hit, and that would perhaps give you some insight that somebody might be trying to attack you at perhaps lower bandwidths than a mitigation provider might be able to ascertain. Is if you're normally getting 100 megabits per second of traffic, and somebody puts a little bit of a 20 megabits of ICMP3 on top of that, it might not show up so easily if you don't have some means of picking up on it. So anyway, those are perhaps some good practices to have some insight into what's going on in your network ahead of time and pick up on any anomalies that show up.
In the Internet Weather Report, we often see that ICMP traffic in that second pie chart, and we kind of ignore it as being backscatter or innocuous, and I still believe most of it is, but you might need to take a little closer look at it. But then if this is DOS traffic, it wouldn't necessarily show up as scanning either. You target it at a specific IP address where the firewall sits in front of it, and
Yep, it would be a different alert type for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, Jim, thank you for that segue, and thank you, Colin, for bringing this story to us. Let's take a quick look at the internet weather over the last week or so here. And first and foremost, the top 10 most probe ports. Port 23 is still showing a good 75% of the activity, perhaps slightly more. That's been consistent over the last several weeks here. I think we are slightly down from previous weeks. We'll take a little closer look at that. Followed by port 22 TCP, that's SSH, and then followed by 80 TCP, that's web 3389 TCP, that's remote desktop protocol, and then 2323 TCP. We're going to take a little closer look at that one. There's some activity, although it's not increased from previous weeks, but it certainly is prevalent among these IoT devices. And then followed by 1911 TCP. That's basically that's related to industrial control port. And then 1433 TCP. That's Microsoft's SQL database. Followed by 21 TCP FTP. That one I think is actually down a little bit, but one that obviously you want to be paying attention to any FTP servers you have out there, because they tend to be sometimes an unknown treasure trove of information just waiting to be stolen. And then 445 TCP. Followed by 123 UDP, that'd be network time protocol. And then looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, again, about 75% of it being port 23. I think that was up on the order of about 780,000 sources through the course of the day. It's certainly not the highest we'd seen. We had seen it exceed 1 million at one point, but it's certainly pretty high in the overall. And then what do you know? The next port showing up here is ICMP type 3, code 3. This is looking at it from a scanning point of view, so it's probably not related to the activity that we were talking about. This tends to be backscatter from a denial of service attack. That is, it looks like a source, which would be the targeted attack, that's basically screaming back at the sources saying, this port's unreachable, why are you sending this traffic to me? So I generally don't talk about it in the context of this because it is backscatter, and we'd have to dig into it a little bit further to really validate what the cause of this. And by the way, scanning activity can cause that as well. That is, as scans are hitting ports, they're going to tend to reply back to the source that's asking those questions or probing them. Nevertheless, followed by 445 TCP, again, continuing to see the configure activity or things that tend to mimic that sort of activity. So there's certainly other types of scanning on the network looking for devices that might be susceptible to a file sharing attack or something along those lines. Followed by 8 ICMP, that's basically ping requests. And then followed by 80 TCP, that's web activity. 2323, as I said, we'll take a little closer look at that. 22 TCP, we'll take a little closer look at that one as well. And then again, some additional ICMP ports showing up here. I should say ICMP types actually. So looking at scan probes and sources on port 23 TCP, as you can see here, looking at the top graph, we are not at the peak in terms of the number of probes that have been taking place. We had peaked out, I guess actually last week, on the order of, maybe it was certainly within the last 2 weeks, on the order of about 7 billion probes per hour. That's a really big number. I don't think I've ever seen that many any time prior in any port in the past. But it is down to roughly about 2/3 of what it was previously, so around 5 billion probes per hour. And then next is on the bottom graph, the number of sources doing that probing, and it's been relatively flat over the last few weeks, not a significant growth and not a significant decrease. And as you can see, where it peaked out was just prior to the basically the publication. We talked a little bit about the attack on Krebs on security, and that was a large attack. It kind of highlighted this IoT thing, botnet, and that I think caused a little bit of a decrease in activity, or certainly some dispersion of that activity. Looking at scan probes and sources on port 22 TCP, this is the SSH protocol. What I did on the probes is averaged it over a 24-hour period. So typically when we show this graph and we're looking at 180 days of activity, there are lots and lots and lots of spikes. And but if you kind of blurred your eyes, you could kind of see that there were some density spikes in there. Well, by just putting a 24-hour moving average on the graph here, it sort of smooths that out a little bit. and gives you a little bit of an idea of what's going on. So it looks like there's basically some sort of a spiking in activity and probing. I think that's actually a research organization that's doing this, so I don't know that the spikes are all that significant. But if you look at it, kind of across the graph there, it does look like there's a general uptick in the number of probes that are taking place on the port. Again, possibly oriented toward some of these IoT botnets, perhaps diversifying a little bit and trying to find devices on port 22 TCP that could be used for attack activities. And then on the bottom graph here, the number of sources that are probing, as you can see, there was a little bit of a spike about a week ago that's way over to the right of the graph, and it's sort of tapering off. And so this has been, roughly stable. Now, just to put it into perspective, here we're measuring thousands of devices, where when we were looking, or unique source addresses, whereas when we were looking at the telnet graph earlier, we were measuring in hundreds of thousands of devices. So this is 2 orders of magnitude lower in terms of the number of sources that are doing that probing activity. And looking a little bit more closely at port 2323 TCP, this was actually one that is sometimes used as an alternate port for telnet, I think to kind of sort of hide in the noise perhaps. You can only hide so long by using alternate ports. Nevertheless, this is showing 90 days of activity compared to the 180 days we were looking at previously. This activity is relatively new. It's only been sort of taking place over the last 60, maybe 70 days or so. And you can see there was a big spike at the beginning, and it sort of tapered off toward the end, so it's not as significant as it was before. But still, in this particular case, we're actually looking at more than we saw probing on port 22. That is, looking at the bottom graph, the number of sources up around 10,000, and it's peaked out as high as 50,000, so 55 or so thousand. So certainly, this is a case where it's more clearly going after IoT, that is IoT devices, that IoT botnet going after these devices. Now, I did a little bit of searching on Shodan, found that Microtik, that's Mikrotik, it's basically a manufacturer. They have routers in their device repertoire, and some of these apparently are offering a telnet interface on the internet. And there were on the order of about tens of thousands of devices that were exposed this way. There were some other things that were using port 2323 as well. But I think, Colin, you had pointed out that in some of our analysis we had observed that we had seen denial of service activity coming from devices that showed this interface.
Yeah, so the Microtik routers, some of the IPs that we looked at here had a couple interesting aspects to them. One, recursive DNS open, so they could be a reflector for a DNS denial of service attack. As well, they have a bandwidth tester tool exposed. So definitely a lot of potential for these to continue the DDoS trend.
Yeah, and so it's interesting you point out, and they are not unique in this sense. There have been a lot of devices that are exposing a DNS interface, I should say, not necessarily a service, but an interface to the internet, and allowing them to be facilitating denial of service attacks through that interface. But generally what they do is they just relay it to their real DNS service provider. So it's kind of a loop back interface. That is, they get a DNS request, they loop it right back out to their DNS server provider, and then the answer comes back. And so it ends up not only being a burden on that device, but it becomes a burden on their DNS service provider, which can be a little bit of a, I'll say in some cases, is annoyance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I guess another aspect of this, is kind of interesting, because when I was doing a little research on this, I ran across the forum, and there was a user that was complaining that their device keeps popping up to 100% CPU utilization for no reasonable explanation that they could pick up on, and then it would go back to normal, and it was sort of a strange little diagnostic back and forth that was going on in the forum. So these will be the types of behaviors you'd want to look for. If you have unexplained CPU spikes in your devices, you might want to take a look at what types of activities are going in and out, or perhaps what processes are running on your device and using that CPU.
And as we've said the last couple of weeks on the show, that the Mirai source code that was released in late September, one of the ways that it is probably what's doing most of the scanning. When we saw the source code, it scans for telnet on both 23 and 2323. So this is likely mostly Mirai traffic. And I finally got my honeypot set up so it is collecting login attempts on 2323. So maybe after the first of the year, we'll take a look at what we're seeing there.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that morphs, because as a part of the Mirai source code, I think it did have sort of a list of password, usernames and passwords, which was perhaps one of the more, for the folks that are building these botnets, one of the more valuable aspects of it. It'll be interesting to see how that's morphed in terms of the behavior that we're actually seeing.
Yeah, see if it gets beyond that 100 or whatever they had in the source code there.
Yeah. Last item we'll mention here is scan probes on port 5632 TCP, and this happens to be a port, the default port associated with PC Anywhere. So that's I think akin to remote desktop protocols. So folks that are using PC Anywhere, you want to make sure that you're not exposing 5632 to the internet, especially unnecessarily, and especially with any weak passwords on those devices. We're just looking at 30 days of activity in this graph, so this is relatively recent activity. I think actually from the analysis, it appears that most of this activity is from a research organization, and it looks like they did sort of a hard scan, and it looks like they're doing basically an update every day or so here. So. I'm not particularly concerned about it from a exploit point of view, but certainly one that folks should be paying attention to anyway. It is a point of vulnerability. So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attThreatTraq@list.att.com, and you can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATDBusiness. And I'd like to thank you, Jim Clausing, for joining us today. Thank you, Colin Connor, for joining us. And I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.